Welcome to Romance Studies at 202, Literature and Culture from Modernism to the Present. And today I'm delighted to have with me Professor Naomi Lindstrom, who is the Gale Family Foundation Professor in Jewish Arts and Culture, and also Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin, and who's written extensively on Latin American fiction in the 20th century, and in fact wrote the prologue or the foreword to the book we'll be discussing today, which is María Luisa Bombal's The Shrouded Woman. Professor Lindstrom, or Naomi, if I may, thank you so much for being prepared to do this and to talk about this fascinating short novel. How would you suggest approaching this text?
Well, I think the way to think about it is that there are several different approaches that are equally valid. The one that captivated people when the novel first came out was that it was so mysterious, that it was so far from realism, especially since Chilean literature had been associated very heavily with regionalism and realism. And María Luisa Bombal, obviously Chilean, but she was writing in the completely opposite direction. And all this mysterious business that goes on in all her novels, particularly in this case, the dark forest. There's this dark forest. Maria Griselda, when she's driving everyone insane, not just the men, but the women, with her excessively potent beauty, the solution is to put her in the dark forest. And there are several other things that go on in the dark forest. And then all the mysterious rain and mist and mysterious glimmerings, just a very non-realistic representation of country life.
I was
And
very,
mhm, that's one way you can just appreciate being taken into this somewhat magic world. Although it's a magic world where people are quite unhappy. It's not it's not very happy magic. And then as the years went on, different approaches were taken to her work. Including for a while there was a vogue of seeing it as an existential novel linked to existentialism. That's sort of gone out of vogue. And then in the 70s, it was rediscovered as a proto-feminist novel. And if you look at it, actually there is a lot about the situation of, well, not just Ana Maria, but these upper class Chilean women in general. They are in their husband's house. It's the husband's house that's mentioned, and she doesn't really even feel very comfortable being there. And they're sort of like fancy pieces of furniture that have been acquired to adorn the house. They don't really have that much to do with themselves. And of course, there's a limited amount that you can expect from a husband. In the case of the husband here, he's not only constantly unfaithful, but also he doesn't seem to take much interest in his wife. He's in his own masculine world or whatever. And she doesn't even realize that he loves her until he shows up after she's dead and sheds tears. So they don't have a very good situation, and they are trying to occupy their minds one way or another, try to do something that finds meaning. So you can either read it just to be swept into this sort of vaguely magic world or enchanted kind of world, especially the nature in the forests. The houses are not as magic as the forest. Or you could read it more as a social critique. Or you could read it a different way if you wanted to.
there's a lot here to unpack. I mean, it is a very atmospheric novel in both the literal atmosphere, the question of the rain and so on and so forth of southern Chile, but also, I guess, yes, this sort of sense of well, she's summing up her life, right? She's looking back over her life and allowing all these emotions, which perhaps she hadn't been able to permit herself while she was alive, to come in and sort of making a calculus
Mhm.
of her life at the end of it. Um, how much? I guess the question of it being proto-feminist, I sort of one of the things I struggle with is how much critique there is. In some ways, it's more mournful or lamentation than
Mhm.
she should be more angry, I sometimes feel.
Right. I think that's true. Um, Now, Maria Luisa Bombal translated it herself, probably with a good deal of help from her husband, Saint-Paul. But when she translated La Última Niebla, the work that is most similar to it, um, she rewrote it completely when she was translated into English, and the feminist part came out much more openly. But this was partly because they were trying to market it and they were hoping a Hollywood film would be made of it. So everything is made much more explicit, including the protagonist now has a name before she was anonymous and so forth. And she gets into um, a rather sour discussion with her husband, and he points out that she is not allowed to own land, being a woman. Things like that are not in the original. So it could be brought out, but I think you're right that in the original Spanish version um, of both of those works, the critique really doesn't come to the surface.
There's a lot of sense in therefore rather than critique of more I don't know, missed opportunities. So, for
Mhm.
instance, as you mentioned, uh, the protagonist, Anna Maria, well, in some ways, she's never quite the protagonist of her life. That's kind of interesting too.
Right.
We might
Mhm.
want to mention that. She doesn't realize that the what might have been with her husband, right? Her marriage, she has this essentially unhappy marriage, but there's a sense that, as you say, her husband actually cared more deeply than he was perhaps allowed to let on. And there are other senses that it's only at the again in this transition towards what she calls the second death, right? The first death, biological death, the second death, a sort of spiritual death, I suppose, that she's able to come to terms or make amends for or seek forgiveness for or accept forgiveness for what might have been in the course of this of her life.
Those are really good comments. Also, since her life is over and she can't change anything, she also is a bit more distanced from it. Like her husband, she says she concludes that she neither loved him nor hated him. It was just what it was. So she's able to stand back from it now that nothing can be changed. But missed opportunities, I think that's a really great phrase.
And then in terms of the fact that yeah, she can't do anything. It's it's as if she finds a voice finally at the end of this life. But of course, the irony is that no one can hear. It's a voice that never is unheard. That is sort of wasted. I don't know, wasted is going too wrong. Um, uh, but finds no audience apart from us, of course, the readers.
Mhm. Right.
Um, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the question of realism. Um, I guess often Latin American literature of the first half of the 20th century is perhaps unfortunately seen always in relationship to the magical realism, which comes to the fore and makes Latin American literature famous in the 1960s and 1970s. Do you think that's a helpful way to think about this particular book and Maria Luisa Bombal?
Well, I'll tell you, it's the way I got it through UT Press, University of Texas Press, by focusing on the link to magical realism. And you may notice on the cover, toward the bottom, there's a quotation from Carlos Fuentes. Maria Luisa Bombal is the mother of us all. And they actually said for me to look through statements made by authors from the magical realism era or the boom and find praise for Maria Luisa Bombal. At one time, that was the way to get any earlier work of Spanish American literature back in print was to link it
Yeah.
to magical realism. That happened when I translated um, The Seven Madmen by
Hmm.
Roberto Arlt, which is from the 20s. And to get any US publisher interested in publishing it, what I had to do was find statements by people of the famous generation praising Arlt or calling attention to him in some way.
And then, but perhaps now we could think about reading it no longer under the shadow of magical realism. I don't think magical realism perhaps has quite the grip on
Mhm.
the imagination of Latin American of what it means to read Latin American literature as
I
it
hope
does now.
not.
Um, we've talked a little bit about gender here, which is obviously a key aspect, but class is obviously very important for this book. I mean, she's not just a woman; she's an upper class or upper middle class a woman. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, yes, one of the most interesting bits is when her old nurse comes in. She's actually the woman that caught her when she was born, and that her mother just handed her over to this nurse. And she really seems to be the one with whom she has an undilutedly warm relationship. This woman who's obviously from a peasant family, much lower social class. But her mother is described in perhaps not the fondest terms. She remembers her uh, pulling her skirts away when the daughter tried to grab onto them and handing her over to the nurse and so forth. And then she, of course, committed the betrayal of dying. So she's much more attached to this old nurse who's stuck by her side through thick and thin.
And that also makes me think about the way in which this is also a book about a family, right?
Mhm.
So there's about that we have the relationship to her mother, her parents, her father, um, and then also her various lovers, and then her husband, and then of course this I don't know, a strained relationship with her children as well. She has actually I write a little family tree at the back to try and keep it all in focus. She has three children, right? She has two sons and and a daughter, and then of course um, their spouses as well. You mentioned Maria Griselda, who is her I think her eldest son's wife, and so her daughter-in-law. How do you think that the question of family relations and relationships between the generations plays out in this book?
Well, in retrospect, she seems to feel sorry for her grown children, especially the ill-fated Fred, who had the bad luck to fall completely under the spell of Maria Griselda and end up with his wife's suicide. So she just seems to see them as people who kind of missed the boat in a way or took the wrong path in life. But now that she's out of it, she can't change anything. She seems to be more um, compassionate to them, but see them as sort of almost as sort of losers, even though they followed a fairly conventional life.
This sense we've now mentioned it various times that of I don't know lament or missing the boat or people not making of their lives what they might have done, and this sort of pervasive air and atmosphere again of unhappiness of people who are not able fully to express themselves, or if they do, they get like Maria Griselda, they become treated they're seen as mad, right? They're seen as they're banished to the forest, as it were.
Or she's sort of a sorceress because you can't have her around men without their practically going mad with fascination with her.
And yet at the end, there's a sort of sense of acceptance. There's a moment almost at the very end of the book, um, where the question is, what would you imagine or what would you want heaven to be? And I think she says something like, I would like it to be just like it is here below. There's also a sense of, I don't know, affection for uh, now she's finally lived it.
Mhm.
Those she manages to purge herself of those sorrows, I suppose.
Well, yes, she's able to take a more distance view. That is interesting that she says she would like it to be like life here below, because obviously she spent a huge amount of her life being completely miserable. Another thing that's in The Shrouded Woman, and it's just in pretty much all of her fiction, which isn't, of course, very abundant, is an extreme fascination with women's hair. Um, she actually wrote a treatise called Trenzas, Braids, It's not a short story, it's an essay that women should not cut themselves off from the source of their strength, which is their abundant hair. And it shows up over and over again in the Shrouded Mystics. Again, this Maria Griselda, and she's seen at one point she's in a river and she's getting her hair wet, and actually she's getting fish out of her hair, so she's sort of turning into a nature goddess. Um,
Again, that relates to the notion that you mentioned earlier on. I think that in this book or in the society that this book depicts, women are very much decorative, right? An
mhm,
adornment. Of course, Maria Luisa Bombal sort of turns that around here to some extent, in that in that everything is now from the perspective of this woman, and we finally hear her views on things, right? She's finally she finally finds her voice, as we said before, but it's a voice without an audience, and yet she's still, of course, an object. She's more of an object, perhaps to some extent, than ever before,
mhm.
as she's this corpse on display to the people who gather to see her through to the afterlife, I suppose.
And it's mentioned that she's very ornamentally displayed, that her body is reposing on these sheets that are monogrammed, and it's just a very they've sort of turned her into this object of display that's very luxurious and very beautiful. And she also mentions her hair again, that her hair is piled behind her. So she has this mass of hair behind her head. She's lying on her back. And this is sort of part of her strength.
Yeah, she's very used to being looked at.
Right.
And here she's again back to, but we're almost running out of time, but back to some of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, about the sort of atmospherics, this kind of mystery, the forest, this sort of sense of space that she's in the countryside, she's at this country house, while the men are elsewhere doing their business, right? Um, but here at last, she's at the center of attention uh, in this in this moment, and everyone now. She sort of brings everything together, as even the former lovers and the husband and the children and so on come and kind of recognize that had a she bound everything together to some extent. Is that fair?
That's true. She's much more appreciated than she thought she would be, particularly by her husband and by Ricardo, who both of them made her feel that she was not being taken into account. But now that her life is over, she sees that she really was important to them.
I think that's a beautiful place to stop.
Sure.
Thank you so much
Oh, my pleasure.
for this conversation. I think it was
Mhm.
very productive. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you.